Good afternoon, Dr. Ivanis Kagel. I think it's pronounced correctly. If not, please let me know. It's a great pleasure to have you here this afternoon. I hope you are nearby the Earth, something somewhere in the space. But it would be great to listen to you to see a perspective of brain compliance in a space. So I appreciate your timing with us this afternoon, and please you can continue presenting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's just amazing to be here. And yes, I am here with my wonderful M earrings on. And it's a celebration of our illustrious founder in this wonderful symposium. But it's also because I'm teleporting and telecommunicating from Mars, as you can see. So welcome to my spaceship. And it's an incredible honor to be able to share with you my view from space. Apologize for any latency, but we have up to 20-minute latency from Mars. So let's launch, let's get started. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, I'm Dr. Yvonne Kagel, astronaut, aerospace surgeon, and retired Air Force colonel. And you are amazing. It has been 8 minutes and 31 seconds. And you are approximately 250 miles above the Earth, going 17,500 miles per hour. Oh my gosh. And the view is absolutely amazing. And already your body, your DNA is programming the recoding of your system for the oxygen depleted, radiation laden, water deprived, hypothermic darkness of our silent cosmos. And as you unbuckle your seatbelt, you're floating. Within 90 days, your body is already divesting itself of its excess muscle mass and bone density, as your, albeit 2-inch taller self, had the audacity to pack going to Mars, Moon, and beyond, all of these amazing things about the system human adaptation. So the body is incredible. It is remarkably made. And all of these things are going on within that 8 minutes and 31 seconds. Do you know that at 8 minutes and 31 seconds, 0.1, you are no longer the same person as when you left the planet? Your body is already starting to adapt and to evolve, because the body has this remarkable capacity and resiliency for the brain and the body to endure, adapt, and evolve what we call this system human. So welcome to the YOU-niverse, the universe. Now, where did it all begin? Well, I can't say where your universe began, but I can say that mine began at the top of old oak tree one hot summer night, playing hide and go seek. No one could find me. It had been 3 hours. I'm going for the Guinness Book of World Record because everyone is looking, they're looking left and right, east and west, but no one is thinking about looking north and south. And there I was, north of the old oak, talking to that man on the moon, dreaming with the stars, when suddenly out of the darkness, I heard someone calling my name, a familiar voice, Yvonne, Yvonne, Yvonne. And I knew in that moment, destiny had finally found me. I was ready to take that great giant leap. Not a wise thing to do when you're 10 years old at the top of an old oak tree. Actually, not a wise thing to do at any age, but I was ready when just before I jumped, I realized that that voice was my dad calling me to come down and come inside. I was just inconsolable. When I came in, I remember thinking, this had better be good. This has better be epic. And guess what? It was, because my father was silently pointing towards the screen of our old, grainy, rabbit-eared TV with this grainy image on it. Now, you all may not know, but back in the day, TVs had an antenna, and my job was to keep adjusting that antenna to catch the signal. Not too unlike your Wi-Fi cell phones and other devices here today. Time hasn't changed a whole lot, but that was my job. But I knew something important was going on that night because my dad signaled for me to come around to the front of the TV. That was unheard of. And as he pointed at the TV, he silently whispered at that grainy image and said, "That's human walking on the moon for the very first time." Yes, my friends, that hot summer night happened to be July 20th, 1969. At that moment, my dreams took wings and I've never looked back. Fast forward, undergraduate degree in biochemistry, San Francisco State University, on to the University of Washington School of Medicine, where I earned my medical degree on an Air Force scholarship. Now, all of this is coming off of the wings of being a Girl Scout. So already my explorer spirit had itself tested and proven to be anything possible. So after 22 years as a senior flight surgeon, I wanted to do more than fly in the high performance jets that I had been training and serving in. So rising to the rank of full bird colonel with 22 years of yanking and banking and F-111s, F-15s, F-16s, F-18s, heavy helicopters, air-to-air refuelers, anything going to altitude. After about actually 15 years, I began to feel like those jets didn't go quite fast enough, nor quite high enough. And the only way to get faster and higher back then was 2 solid rocket boosters and 3 main engines, the space shuttle, taking you 250 miles above the Earth, off of 7.5 million pounds of thrust, launching at 17,500 miles per hour on your way to Mach 25, and you're launched. So that's where we are. Our mission in space is to go back to that moon, back to that hot summer night, July 20th, 1969, and then on to Mars and beyond. And our mission is one of sustainability of all systems: mechanical, electrical, excavation, propulsion, additive manufacturing, life support, and yes, the system human. So that's what we're looking at in space, is the remarkable capacity and resiliency of the human body to endure, adapt, and evolve outside of our planet of origin, off the planet, in altered gravity environments, whether it be potentially the depths of the ocean, yet to be discovered, all the way to destinations in space. And in order for the human system to survive, not just survive, but thrive too, adaptation is necessary. It is crucial. It is vital. And it starts right at 8 minutes and 31 seconds when you enter the realm of microgravity of space. And it continues as we move through various altered gravity environments, be it the 1/6 gravity of the moon, 1/3 gravity of Mars, and anything in and around and between. We're in space now. So how do we succeed in that? Well, it begins with adaptation. And it's important to understand what adaptation is. We've always talked about space adaptation syndrome. We've known for a long time that the body adapts, but we call it a syndrome. At least I call it a syndrome for a particular reason, because syndrome does not mean disease. Space is incredible, but it can also be injurious. And so for me, syndrome is what happens when you can successfully reset your body's coding to a new normal. That's called adaptive homeostasis. But to the degree that we fall short of that, that is called disease. So space is not a disease any more than Earth is a disease. Even on Earth, we do fall short of our new homeostatic normals. And that's where medicine comes in, and alternative healing and the whole genre of our health and self-renewal. But to the extent that someone is what we call disabled, what I call hyper-able, that is not falling short. That is a new normal, a new homeostasis. And health and performance is relative to your frame of reference. So if your frame of reference is Earth and gravity, then you might find yourself somewhat challenged in an environment that has settled into gravity. But if you take that same hyper-able person and put them in the context of space, guess what? That's hyperability. For example, somebody who has paraplegia and has learned to function and live and thrive, perform in an upper body environment, arguably may be a better candidate for space to translate the space of space. So it's all relative to our frame of reference. So space adaptation syndrome is what we started talking about for the body. We've known for a long time through our observations that the body does adapt. There's an early adaptation called the acute or early space adaptation syndrome, and there's a later one when you've been in space for a time. The early one is from about 24 hours to 72 hours, so 1 to 3 days. And that's just the translocation of your plasma volume body fluids from your legs caudally all the way up to your upper body, cephalically, so up towards your head. And that redistribution is what we call early spaceflight syndrome. It congests your sinus passages in your inner ear and your neurovestibular systems so that early on you have spatial disorientation, you might feel some vertigo, some nausea, vomiting even, but that quickly subsides as the extra fluid that's accumulated in your head starts to subside. The fullness in your face goes down over 1 to 72 hours. Your eyes aren't so red, your brain isn't so congested, and your kidneys start to kick up so that they expel the excess fluid, and you reach that new adaptive homeostasis normal. Now you actually overshoot it so that you're relatively dehydrated, but the heart performs. Your pulmonary vasculature expands, and somehow you get to that new normal of performance. Now, other things begin to happen throughout the body. Your appetite goes down as your stomach becomes more edematous, and your sleep pattern, your circadian rhythm has some degree of being offline, somewhat derailed. You don't sleep quite as much, maybe more like 6 hours. And as you go into later space adaptation syndrome, meaning after 72 hours, and certainly by about 90 days, the absence of loading of gravity on your body makes your brain start to think, let's be energy efficient here. We don't need the extra mass of the muscles. We don't need the extra density of the bone. And those muscles atrophy, bones start to demineralize. And as our vertebrae separate and we get taller, our limbs become more spindly. our torso starts to narrow and curve in, and we're all into conservation of energy. That's not a disease. It works great for space. But as we re-enter altered gravity environments that have higher gravity, now we need to adjust back, such as for re-entry, orthostasis, weakness that we see when we return back to gravity, such as Earth. And to the degree that we successfully correct, syndrome. To where we fall short, that's where we need some clinical intervention and attention. Now, that's space adaptation syndrome. That happened during a time when my hypothesis, what I surmised, was that there was no such thing as a blood-brain barrier. In my mind, it didn't make sense that the body would adapt independent of the brain. So decades ago, when I was talking about neuroplasticity and lymphatics, it was dismissed because the scientific community at that time believed that there was a blood-brain barrier and all this adaptation happened in the body, but nothing was really going on in the brain beyond the neurovestibular conditions, symptoms, syndrome that I talked about. However, over time, listening to the reporting of astronauts as they came back from space, they began to realize something was going on. And by about 2016, space adaptation syndrome became SANS, space flight neuroocular syndrome, where there was a formal acknowledgement that there is something happening adaptively in the brain. And that was pretty exciting, but this is where, and I apologize, a whole series of puns will come in. Just bear with me, they'll dissipate in time. But it was somewhat short-sighted. They're focusing on neuroocular, the eye, when certainly the audience here knows what I know, that there's so much more going on in the brain. You've got the ventricles, you've got the choroid plexus, you've got the parenchyma, you have the neurovasculature in there, you have the arachnoid, you've got even the skull, this expansible skull itself. And we're serving ourselves short. We're doing ourselves a disservice to just, again, pun, focus just on what's happening in the eye, in the ocular system. But I can kind of understand in some ways why that's the case, because as we know, the eyes are the window to our microverse, to that physiologic microverse within us. That the eyes are one of the more sensitive organs to changes that happen throughout our entire brain-body system. So it is a good stepping off point to take that next giant leap. It's a tipping point. And so let's talk about SANS. What is it? Well, that's what makes it so hard to talk about. We don't fully appreciate exactly what it is. So it might be better to describe what characterizes SANS. SANS is characterized by 7 signature features, with the 7th one having an asterisk. And I'll go into these more. But 3 of them are structural. 2 of them have to do with the retina, with one of them being retinal ischemia. And one of them has to do with acuity shifts. So your refractive error has a shift that occurs with it. One of them has to do with what is the hallmark salient metric of SANS, which is edema of the optic disc, meaning the kind of the head of that optic nerve there at the insertion point in the cup. And then the last one is the one that has the asterisk, and that's ICP, intracranial pressure. There are 2 very divided communities on that. Some feel like space does affect intracranial pressures, and others, because they haven't seen it documented and demonstrated post-flight, feel that it's not a part of SONS, that there is nothing that significantly creates a disturbance in the intracranial pressures. That's a whole fascinating discussion. My feeling, the feeling of many others, is we can't rule it in or out. And until we rule it out, we can't say that it doesn't play a role. And why can't we rule it out? Is because we don't do lumbar punctures, LP, before flight. We certainly can't do it during flight. We can't do MRIs and CAT scans during flight. To assess intracranial pressures, we've used what they call the OAE, ocular, audio, or acoustic emitter, looking at the signal or signature of the vibration of the tympanic membrane, sound to reflect what kind of fluid pressures are going on inside the brain. And the other one is the looking at the ophthalmic artery using Doppler, transcranial Doppler. There are other things that we're looking at. There are other ideas that I have as well that have to do with looking at the rate of nystagmus against the pressure and the response of the autonomic system. But to go further than any of these ideas, we don't have good external, rapid, safe, comfortable ways beyond what I've mentioned to assess it until now. And I'll be talking more about that external, non-invasive, comfortable, rapid platform form factor that has a very exciting potential to give us that insight. I'll try not to do any more puns with that. But of course, I'm talking about the Brain for Care sensor. So let's go back and talk about the history of SONS a little bit more first. Understanding that we're still kind of on the fence about intracranial pressures. What they've been able to identify is that looking at structural changes based on hind limb studies and bed rest studies, the sense is that as the fluid redistributes up towards the head, it's localizing posterior to the brain from about the vertex back and deep within areas that we typically see some of the proteins and other amyloids of Alzheimer's accumulating, areas of the hippocampus, and guess what? Where the optic center resides. So the thinking is, could some of the translocation of this fluid, when you leave gravity and it begins to float up in your body, could it be that the optic center is becoming its own kind of ventricle or depot, accumulating fluid that doesn't necessarily disturb the rest of the brain or intracranial pressures, although again, we don't know. But certainly it appears to be accumulating there, and without a good drainage system may explain the features of SONS that I'll be talking about. So with that said, some of the structural features that we see are flattening of the globe, and that's more posteriorly as I described. And the other things that we see are folds, wrinkles in the retina and the choroid itself. So those choroidal features in the retina have these wrinkles or folds. The other additional finding, and these all point to some mechanical structural process going on, possibly from hydrostatic translocation and pressures that are occurring. The other retinal finding that we find are ischemic findings consistent with cotton wool spots. And then, so that brings us to 3, 4 we talked about the intracranial pressure. 5, we talked about the edema of the optic disc. 6, the other finding that is part of the constellation of SONS is what we call the hyperoptic shift. It means that the refractive error shifts significantly so. And why that's important is that was the symptom that astronauts began talking about that made us start focusing, there's a pun, sorry, focusing in again on the eye, on spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome. And what happens is there appears to be a refractive error shift. Appears, it's documented. And it changes the acuity. And crew members were returning from flight noticing that their acuity had changed. There wasn't nausea, there wasn't headache per se consistently reported, although there were some reports of that. There weren't a lot of the typical things that you might see with the perilymphatic and other areas of the brain being involved. Now, astronauts aren't the best reporters, so we may not always report all of what we're experiencing. But what we were able to document was that there was a shift in refractive error. Now, even though they call it a hyperoptic shift, and the majority are towards the hyperoptic range or farsightedness and predominantly male, there's a lot of reporting and documentation of near version myopic shifts of the refractive error. So what happened back in 2016 when SONS became formally recognized was that a survey went out to 300 crew members post-flight. And they found that 30% of space shuttle crew members had experienced changes in their acuity. They reported that. 30%. But in long duration ISS crew members, it was as high as 60%. And today is upward of 70% are reporting noticeable acuity changes. Back in 2016, at that time, they found that 16% of individuals had edema of the optic disc. 16% of flown crew members who were surveyed, 16% had edema of their optic disc. And that's why it became the hallmark indicator, the hallmark signature that SONS is based on. Now, back in 2016, and this was reported in 2017, there were 47 crew members who had flown ISS. 24 of those crew members, just over half of them, not only had edema to their optic disc, but also reported at least one or more of the other constellation of SONS symptoms or signatures, features that I mentioned. 9 of those crew members, 19%, had such a significant shift in their refractive error, upwards of greater than 0.75, almost a 1 diopter shift, that not only was it noticeable, it was severe enough to, in most cases, when this shift occurs, to be permanent. So all of these are indications that something is going on in the brain, that somehow the translocation of those fluids are transcommunicating across not a blood-brain barrier, but a blood-brain bridge. Somehow those pressures are being portaled through. And to me, I call it the principle of conservation of compliance. Looking at the Monroe-Kelly doctrine, it says if you disrupt or disturb volume in one area, somewhere else in the brain, it has to be accounted for and accommodated. And it may not be just through intracranial pressures. looking at, for example, the intracranial end-tidal CO2 compliance, partial CO2, partial pressure CO2 compliance index. It's telling us that the PCI, that there may be more going on than just intracranial pressure. In a healthy brain that's not too young or too densely traumatized, then the reactivity of the neurovasculature in response to different levels of partial pressure CO2 can show exponentially up to a 4-fold increase in flow when the vasculature is dilated. In a healthy brain, that flow doesn't translate to increasing intracranial pressure. Why is that? Because all of those structures that I talked about, not just the ventricles, but the arachnoid and the choroid and the choroidal plexus and the parenchyma and other parts of the brain tissue and the arachnoid and the skull, this expansible skull itself, all of these have areas that can accommodate that redistribution of volume, making that Monroe-Kelly doctrine hold true. That's called compliance. And that's something that's very dynamic, very alive. And I think if we're focused less on intracranial pressures and start looking at intracranial compliance, we will discover so much more is going on in the brain. In particular, that all of the transfer of fluid into the brain is not accounted for by redistribution, translocation, cephalically up towards the head. The body translates up to 2 liters into the brain, and the brain has to move that around. But studies have shown that there is much more movement and volume that the brain sees. So where is that extra volume coming from? Well, we know as intracranial pressure increases, it presses on the choroidal plexus, and it keeps that plexus from, I call it sweating, from releasing cerebral spinal fluid, the lymphatic fluid there. But as that swelling goes down, that plexus starts up again. So that plexus is its own independent system. And it's not even a gradient, because the CSF osmolality and that of the interstitial fluid are similar enough that it's not just a shifting by a gradient from ions, that there is something that is actually actively triggering and stimulating the production of CSF fluid in the brain beyond what the body may be transmitting or portaling through. And that's where the autonomic system comes in. That's where the epithelium of the choroidal plexus is triggered or stimulated in part by the endothelial lining that the vasculature sees and communicates to the autonomic system. So with dense brain trauma, or even with space, if there is dysautonomia, we may not be keeping up with the production of a homeostatic orchestration or handoff of these Monroe-Kelly fluid principles. There's so many questions there. There's so many ways to spin the Rubik cube called the brain, and to spin it both on planet, off planet, and hopefully one day the depths of the ocean. What is limiting us is not having a good external, non-invasive, comfortable, rapid way of assessing it, of assessing the vital sign of the brain, of having some way to look into it. That's our rate limiter step. Enter the Brain for Care system, the sensor. The first time I met the Brain for Care team, I actually flew to Brazil for professional and deeply personal reasons. And for whatever reason, we ended up sitting across from each other at dinner under a rooftop dinner meal and a full moon, incredibly full as July 20th, 1969, when I was at the top of the old oak tree and human was walking on the moon at the same time for the very first time. Amazing. And here I am, full circle, full orbit, talking to the brain care team. And one of the first words out of my mouth was the word compliance. Compliance, a word that I'm used to being met with dismissal at best and scoff and ridicule at worst. And when I said compliance, they heard music. Together, we heard the orchestration of the optimization of brain health and the opportunity to do it both on planet, potentially depths of the ocean, off. On planet, whether it be traumatic brain injury, concussion, neurodegenerative conditions, Parkinson's or Parkinsonian syndrome, whether it be due to end organ failure and the encephalopathies that are associated with it, such as liver or renal encephalopathy. These are ways to get not just a snapshot, but to be able to monitor real time how the brain is breathing, adapting, and maybe even evolving. And not just to get a running vlog of what that is, but a brain care sensor, like what Brain for Care has put together, is something that can also serve as an early warning system to tell us when things are starting to degrade before they go offline enough, where not only do we have symptoms, but we're also potentially looking at full derailment. If we can intervene early on in any and so many of these other conditions and settings and scenarios that I described, we are truly talking about regenerative health, self-renewal, and the true resiliency of the body to not just endure, not just adapt, but to evolve. It is so very exciting. But not only as an early warning system, a sensor like the Brain for Care sensor, looking at the pulse waveform as I wrap things up, is something that can also serve as a way to assess the efficacy of interventions. And I myself have invented something that is an external, comfortable, wearable, low profile. It's a kind of wrap. And it has been shown to have the capacity to accelerate and amplify not just strength and stability of limbs that are deconditioned by injury, illness, or maybe even space flight, but can grow regeneratively new muscle as well. Now, why is that relevant? Is the way that it could interface with the brain care sensor is it also can act as its own kind of artificial, or in a sense, natural gravity. It can replicate gravity by helping to drain the brain as things accumulate. And we can see if things are improving based on that pulse waveform pattern, the strain pattern that is I've identified through dysautonomia. And we can watch that improve real time with pharmaceutical, possibly my wearable invention, with rehabilitation therapies, with so many other interventions that we use to rehabilitate the brain. But the brain is the command and the control for the body. It's amazing, but it takes time, timing, synchronization, it takes titration, and it takes curation. If we can, instead of using only the command and control to rehabilitate the body, and look at the body not just as a pedestal to support the head, but as a steering wheel, if we can bring the limbs and mobility back online for the body, there may be a way to accelerate those neuromuscular connections, and reintegration of the brain to bring it online much faster, since the body is so much more accessible. And something like the Brain Care sensor is the Brain for Care sensor, something that can elucidate and provide the insight that can help us to monitor, titrate, synchronize, and curate our amazing body capacity to regenerate itself. That's it.
Yeah, we have to move for another talk, but I would love to have you after that for answer some questions.